Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the panel, Manning Up for the Nation, State, Media, and China's Regulation Against Sissy Men, co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality and the Global Studies program here at the University of Chicago. I am Yuchen Yang, and I'm a PhD candidate in sociology, and I will be the discussant for the panel tonight. Here with me is Dr. Caterina Fugazzola. She is an Senior Instructional Professor in Global Studies, and she will be our moderator. We are honored to have two amazing sociologists, Professor Yige Dong and Professor Yige Dong, joining us from the West Coast and the East Coast, respectively, for a panel discussion. Welcome to Chicago virtually. So Professor Yige Dong is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. Her research analyzes how transnational institutions evolve and how such evolution challenges or sustains existing forms of domination and resistance. She is currently working on her book, Side Effects, The Transnational Doing and Undoing of AIDS Politics in China, which is under contract with the Oxford University Press. And Professor Yige Dong is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and in the Department of Global Gender and Sexuality Studies at SUNY Buffalo. She is working on a book project from Milltown to iPhone City, Gender, Labor, and the Politics of Care in China, which examines the 7-decade transformation of care work among industrial workers as China has transitioned from a socialist state to a capitalist economy. And for today's panel, we will start with a conversation between the panelists, and we will then open up the floor for the Q&A. I have prepared a few guiding questions to get the conversation going, but before we start, please allow me to give a brief background about this regulation that we have dubbed as China's regulation against Sissy men in our title. On September 2nd, 2021, China issued a set of new guidelines for its media and entertainment industry. While the new regulation covers issues ranging from tax evasion to fandom and youth culture, one section of the guidelines has stirred heated debate on the internet, raising concerns about the LGBTQ and gender non-conforming communities in China. And according to ChinaLawTranslate.com, one of the 8 sections of the guideline issued by the National Radio and Television Administration reads, quote, Section 3, resolutely resist turning everything into entertainment, persist in cultural self-confidence, forcefully carrying forward the exceptional culture of Chinese people, revolutionary culture, and the advanced socialist culture. Set up the correct aesthetic directions for programs, taking strict control of the selection of performers and guests, performance styles, wardrobes and makeup, and so forth. Resolutely reject abnormal aesthetics such as girly men, resolutely resist the tendencies of over-entertainment such as hyping wealth and indulgence, private scandals, negative hot topics, vulgar online celebrity, and embracing ugliness without standards, unquote. And on the same day, the publicity department of the Chinese Communist Party issued a circular which listed excessive viewer focus, abnormal aesthetics, fandom kills, and the trend of adapting boys' love novels into TV dramas as emergent problems that needs comprehensive and targeted rectification. These moves have since been interpreted by China observers as a ban on Sissy men. So for my first question for the panelists, I want to ask, when you heard about this new regulation, what were your thoughts? How does this fit into the current politics in China? Like, is there a history to this? And we can start with Professor Long.
Yige, do you want to go first?
You go first.
I think you will be the expert on the entertainment industry, so I think it would be good to start there.
Oh, all right. Yeah, I can just tackle with this a little bit. No, I'm not surprised at all, because yes, Yuchen, you're right. The state does have a long existing history of telling the public what should be welcome, desirable, and what should not. Especially this moral panic about the crisis of manhood and masculinity. It can be traced back to decades ago. And one notable thing is this discourse about saving the boys, where people in the especially in the education sector, were worried about young boys in China were not manly and muscular enough, because as a matter of fact, to them, the fact is in every level of education, in like from primary school to college, women outnumbered men, and in terms of their academic performance, they also outperformed the men. And this create a perceived seemingly crisis for those who are in charge of the education sector. So since many years ago, every year when there's the National People's Congress, you saw endless proposals about this idea, either to let boys start 1 year later than girls in primary school, or having some quota preserved for men to ensure that they will have, there are enough men represented in different levels of education, so on and so forth. So this kind of top-down imposed policy that reflects a moral panic about the changing of manhood is there. And I think what it is new is this kind of combination of this moral panic and also the attack on the entertainment industry that I actually don't know that much, but I think what I've noticed is the state is trying to tighten its grip because they want to put this industry under control, as it's been kind of flooded of foreign and domestic capital, and it's a very lucrative industry. And this is really in tandem with the concerted effort recently to crack down on the entire private market. That's my take.
Okay, I guess I can just follow on what Yige was saying. Part of me is not surprised. I'm there with her. I think gender discourse in contemporary China, people tend to think of it as just as a state-driven, but actually there are always three different forces. You have the society, you do have the state, but you also have the market. And I think Yige had talked about the sort of development of entertainment industry in the past. I think it's actually just in the past 2 decades. So it has not been really long. And for a very long time, state actually has been implementing more of a gender neutral politics. So that's more of the surprising part, which I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I would say recently, since, the whole crackdown on women's movement, LGBTQ sort of activism, and so on, I'm certainly not surprised at all. It comes down to this. So I think that the state is really responding to what we observe in the past 2 decades, this really sort of liberation and also very, very nice environment, I would say, for China. But I'm definitely surprised by the content, because if you look at the regulation, it's what it tries to, really establish or celebrate as this hegemonic masculinity. It talk about no sissy stuff, okay? This whole repudiation of the feminine. You need to be a sturdy oak. You need to emotional, calm, collected. You need to be aggressive. You need to be daring. It uses soldier and military force as ideal type. Okay, so if you listen to all this toughness, dominance, heterosexual behaviors, restriction of emotional expression, and avoidance of traditionally feminine attitude and behavior, this sounds very American. So this is the kind of thing that caught me off guard, is that if this purpose is to resist the cultural sort of penetration of Japan and Korea, how the heck we ended up like celebrating this American masculinity actually had been, spreading the world since World War II. It's really a projection of American power. So this kind of thing is very surprising because, I mean, at some level, I think since the 1976, since the Cultural Revolution was ended, I think there was always this kind of concern about, cultural pollution. Okay, they wanted to. I think that for the party, it's always very important to install with, the Chinese body a modern socialist morality, robust enough to handle the new challenges of the socialist, market economy that was really originated in the West. So the bodies have always been a battleground for such a rivalry. And there is a lot of sort of things happening in that front. But when it comes to gender, as I mentioned, the gender policy had always been much more neutral. So that part, I think, is very surprising from the state. I think that's something very new. Even though I think in the past, in the 1980s, for example, we did have a crisis of masculinity in China, but that was more of a social sort of panic. And that was also in parallel for what was happening in Europe at the time. There was sort of a working class, sort of this kind of, it's a crisis of working class, but then they translate into sort of masculinity. So in that way, I mean, moral panic always happened around the world. So I don't think there is anything really new about what's going on in China, but from the state, from the party, this is something new. And then what's even more fascinating or ironic to me is that if we were to really celebrate what is Chinese masculinity, then as we look back into the pre-modern sort of tradition, if there was such a thing, then there was not really the male-female masculinity, femininity, or heterosexual, homosexual dichotomies to exist at the first place. This is really a very Western gender discourse. It's really centered on dichotomy. But in pre-modern China, I mean, for men, much more important is their roles as sons, husband, fathers, servers of the emperor. It's not really a sexualized man, okay? You don't really see a lot of muscular sort of a discussion about that. There is not really intimate physical personality attached to masculinity or like this kind of body. And sort of even at the time, the macho heroes were very desexualized. They were super people, okay, but not as a gendered man. And in terms of achieving the harmony, it's really about achieving the full array of human traits and disposition. So manhood was not about excluding feminine traits, but to pursue all of them all together. So there was always a balance of what we call like Wen and, or we would say this cultural attainment and martial valor. Both of them were seen as ideal masculinity, and either was accepted as manly. So when you have the, like Caizi, like the self-restrained sort of Junzi, like my name Yan, actually was reserved for men. It means elegant and smart man. Okay, it was nothing about, okay, muscular or like aggressive, none of that. And even we have a lot of discourse around this kind of very fragile scholars, okay, a lot of poetry and, that on that part. So this kind of very refined features, modest demeanor, someone that's at some level is kind of androgynous, sort of bodily rhetoric of like men. So in that sense, sex-linked symbols were often secondary to others, okay, like more fundamental principles, so more on social life, like kinship, class, monarchy. And so never this kind of fundamental, immutable sort of opposition between femininity and masculinity. So I would say I'm very sort of, I was surprised by the masculine definitions by Xinhua and the People's Daily. I'm like, that's a traditional one that used really by the United States, not from China. So that's my surprising and non-surprising part.
I think I just want to very briefly add something. I think also is kind of in response to one of the questions in the chat. I agree, and I think ontologically, actually, you've reserved in history, observed all different ideal types of manhood, from the most very violent things that's against the women on a daily basis. It's always been there, and also the more in the one binary kind of masculinity that is more about brilliance and wise instead of physical violence. But I think the question is how to make sense of these these different historical conjunctures, whereas different modes of these kind of repertoires and essence are being enacted. So what's the forces political in terms of political economy and the politics behind this, and that goes back to my take. I think in line with what you just have to say, right? This is an interesting historical moment when everybody around the world is really focusing on how's China's next step in terms of strategizing this upcoming US-China rivalry, so on and so forth. So I think that's why our topic today catch a lot of attention as well.
Yeah, that like historical and cultural part is super fascinating, as Professor Long, you pointed out, like how on the one hand, like we tend to think China and US as in a rivalry with each other, but the kind of masculinity the Chinese state is trying to promote in many ways overlaps what we think about masculinities in the US, and also like how this views of masculinity differs from like traditional notions of Chinese masculinities. And I just find it very interesting that like in this section, the expression that like the call to consolidate cultural self-confidence and promote traditional Chinese culture, revolutionary culture, and socialist culture, like make this kind of call before making a critique of effeminate men. Like, I mean, putting traditional culture next to revolutionary culture itself is kind of interesting, but as you just said, the kind of tradition is now really aligned with the kind of view, the kind of personnel or like the personhood, the kind of masculinity that state is trying to promote. So this kind of gets to my next question, right? So in masculinity studies, we tend to talk about how different kinds of masculinities are like coexisting in a global hierarchy and like competing for the hegemonic position. So to what extent can we see this kind of regulation as an attempt to construct a distinctively Chinese version of masculinity as superior to other masculinities in this global hierarchy? Or shall we just consider this as a biological determinist backlash that denies the multiplicity of masculinities in favor of recovering like the so-called the essence of man, that doesn't matter if you're American or you're Chinese? Maybe we could start with Professor Long this time.
Sure. I guess because I study globalization and transnationalism, so for me, it's very difficult. There's never such a thing as, you know, American or Chinese. It's always, I think it's always very important to think of things are like relational. It's always a sort of interactions between different countries and different people. But in that sense, sort of, I think what is going on right now is, I think we've seen it in history. We've seen it in other countries. It's just different combinations of various elements. So I think some audience also asked in the Q&A about the American one. So I guess one of the big sort of background I think here is, like Yuchen was talking about, I think there is certainly, China is coming out. It's, you know, it's sort of this, everybody think it's a rising power, but keep this in mind, it has not happened like forever, okay? China is very, very young. The sort of economic takeoff, the whole like, really want to take on the world, it hasn't happened like a long time ago. And I think the relationship between China and the world, or especially between the East and the West, is always a relationship of power, of domination, of also very varying degrees of complex hegemony and submission. I think we are still not that far away from, I think we still live in the sort of post-colonial world in many ways, which is the sad part is China hasn't really made up its mind about what it want to be. So you would see a lot of research that would show China is repeating what America has been doing, is to becoming this different empire, but in a very similar way. So I want to draw sort of comparison between right now the masculinity crisis, the perceived crisis in China is very similar to what was happening in the US in the 1950s and the 60s. Okay, so remember that was also a time when the United States was sort of growing as this hegemony of the world. Okay, so I think that there are two elements or three elements I would see in terms of this new image of masculinity in China. I think one of the elements, the first element was really the sort of nationalism. Obviously, it's enemy. We have enemies around us. I think there is a reckoning of superiority complex going on that China is trying to claim its leading position in the face of oppositions from not only the West, the US, but also many neighboring countries. So this is a process of sort of formation of collective Chinese identity, and the masculinity and the femininity are very core part of it. So when you think about it back in the 50s and 60s, there was very strong concerns about, decline of American hegemonic masculinity traits, especially around young generation. Okay, it was very similar. And it was in a time when there was the fear of encroachment of communism upon America. And there were millions of help books, magazine articles, educational videos distributed to just instruct the parents how to, be a man, how to educate the kids to be a man for the good of the country. So there are a lot of sort of similarities there. And there is a lot of comparison between, I think, American and European youth in terms of, their physicality, if they can measure up to like a war. Because remember, at the time, there was the Vietnam War. So I think right now, this kind of, the competition between China and, the rest of the world is very much sort of part of this masculinity. And I think it's also the Chinese way of like feeding fear and soliciting anger against the foreign others, or, like gender non-conforming community as the other. And the second component here, I think, is the leaders. I think here there is this supposedly man or masculine man as more capable. And this particular manly sort of manhood I think is not just for the state, but also I think for Chinese society, not as a whole, but many parts of society are designing for very strong, aggressive leader when confronted with this supposedly threat and competition against a rising nation and national community like identity. So I think that sort of right now there is a very huge push even in academy, sort of integration of family and nations again, calling for the return of patriarchy and the whole like Confucius like idea. I think so there was really this kind of calling for leadership. So I think that kind of thing also plays a very big role in this process. So they want they want China to be aggressive, decisive, unemotional, who can take on the world. Okay, that's part of it. Then I think the third part is, I think it also reflects the sort of change of the party and the state. I think the Chinese state, at least before this leadership, Chinese states, the rhetoric tend to project an image of very secure, heroic state. I think that stays the same. However, it also endeavored to construct a sort of very sympathetic and caring image. And the leaders would display a lot of compassion, a lot of rituals for this kind of, how do we care about the people? We are responsive. We always come to our people's rescue. So in many ways, you could see that image was much more feminine than nowadays when we look at the state. I think nowadays, that's what really concerns me, is that the compassionate performance was no longer there. Okay, during the COVID, you don't see like the top leaders came out and like cry in front of, not like that. It's more of the state want a really voluntary obedience, and the state is willing to use force, if the softer strategy fails. I think this kind of obsession with this rise of obsession with soldier and military force as a hegemonic masculinity is very concerning. And I think this kind of like super masculinity is taking root, which really concerns me a lot. And I would say the three parts, the enemy or antagonism against the West, the leadership, and then the whole change of this caring feminine sort of denial or rejection of the past. I would say the three parts of this new masculinity. Yes.
I think my approach here is a little bit different. I just want to actually go back to this poster that Yuchen picked. I guess you picked it for this event. Wu Jing, the Chinese actor, I think featuring in one of his Wolf Warrior series, right? As a method, because if we look at this the production, circulation, and the projection of the message of this movie, I think it can serve as a metaphor about how we understand Chinese masculinity at all different layers, from ontology to discourses. So if you think about first the kind of the reception, the circulation of this movie, of course, it's a big blockbuster in China, and the story, I confess I didn't watch it because I can't really not bear with him. But the story is basically a Chinese overseas Chinese national, I think it's a soldier type of official who was in Africa and who was able to save the female protagonist there. One of the reasons it got so popular was obvious, because it kind of resonated with the rising Chinese ethos among many of the Chinese audience. I would say not all of them, but maybe on average, more muscular macho man would love it. And the second, it kind of projected the Chinese ambition that has not achieved yet, as Long Yan mentioned. It's kind of China is kind of a hegemon in the making. But that kind of projection in the global market, the success of this movie in the global market really ring a bell, right? Make people being very alarmed about the Chinese ambition. It's all metaphorical, because I think we can find a lot of different cultural cases that reflect this logic. But I think the most interesting is if we look at the production of this movie. I just looked it up, right? I heard that the production team had a lot of American crew. For instance, the composer of this original music is Joseph Trapanese, who actually was very successful and in Hollywood, and is best known for his music in Straight Outta Compton, those kind of American movies. And also, if you look at who invested in this production, it's all the big big capitalists in China, who, by the way, right, even though their major target is in China, but where they got the money, right, their capital is all flowing around the globe. They partner, I think Wu Jing also as a representative of the Chinese movie industry, also partner with big real estate developers like I think Wang Jianlin's Wan Da, so on and so forth. That's how complicated and hybrid the situation is now today. This also reminds me of the, people now are talking about the chimerica or chimerica as a concept. So this happy, sweet honeymoon period between China and the US as a symptom of this global capitalism in today's age. And now when we talk about the decoupling, we tend to focus on those country-specific cultural messages that are being sent as if, China, there's a multi-dimensional chess that the China propaganda department is playing. But my speculation, my pure wild speculation here is within the Chinese multi-layer state apparatus, there are also competitions and speculations, and there are government cadres who are guessing what the empire, right, what she is thinking about, and who produce a particular kind of cultural product to make sure they can climb up in the bureaucrat ladder, and that's also probably partially why you saw the harsh ban on alternative masculine representations. But I think this movie, this politics of production of this movie itself may help us shed some new light on how to really take all these complicated phenomena all at once.
Yeah, I also find that movie super, like, in terms of its symbolism and the kind of the story narrative. It's just so fascinating that like the female, I think it's for the World War II, the female protagonist was an American woman, and the American government refused to rescue her, and now there's this Chinese super macho guy, very like with a mastery of the traditional Chinese martial art, like went there to save her and another kid. And just this kind of contrast between the Chinese government and the American government, and there's this kind of positioning China as a super macho hero, whereas positioning probably the only American character in the film as this kind of female heroine that needs to be rescued. It just, this kind of symbolism is just so fascinating. And actually, I want to went back to a point that Professor Dong mentioned earlier about this kind of concern about masculinity crisis in the kids. Is also like the kind of education achievement gap between boys and girls, which we are also seeing in other parts of the world, because I think that the theme of youth was pretty central to this kind of policy, because like especially if we think about like masculinity and nationalism and the masculinity crisis, it's hard to bypass this image of the sick man of East Asia. And recently we have seen how this kind of nationalist intellectual, Liang Qichao's famous phrase, if the youth are strong, the nation will be strong, being rephrased as if the youth are sissy, the country will be sissy. But there's this kind of persistent attachment to the youth for like 100 years or so. And if we contextualize this kind of policy within what the other policy that was implemented over the summer, right? There's this kind of a crackdown on the test prep tutoring industry. There's this limit on online gaming industry, so that now like minors in China can only play games on like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, like 8 to 9 p.m., like 3 hours. And even just if we just look at this kind of this specific policy about masculinity in the media, it has this kind of framing of like child protection, in the sense that we need to educate the youth to be like limit their irrational consumption of the media. Like we should not allow minors to participate in talent shows. We should not allow them to join fan clubs. So the question of youth seems very central to all these policies that's being implemented in the summer. So I was kind of curious if the two panelists have any thoughts about this kind of connection across policies, and maybe thinking about how, as China scholars, how should we position the question about the child or the youth into studies of like Chinese politics or Chinese media or gender and sexuality. And we can start with Professor Dong this time.
All right. So I think, yes, it's always very useful to historicize a little bit here. And I think you're right. The site, discourses around and practices around how to raise a kid and how to be a woman and a wife and how to be a man have always been very, very important sites where you see different powers negotiate. And that, yes, all the way go back to Liang Qichao's and his allies calling for, women should become the women of mom of the nation, 国民之母, and you should make them better educated and healthy, because they're going to be the bearer of the next generation of China, that is a new China, right? And yes, in terms of youth education and how to become a parent parents to cultivate the most intelligent kids. Another example is definitely in the 80s, where when there was the first time launching of the one-child policy, the discourse is basically one is enough as long as you can produce the most healthy and intelligent one, a kind of a very eugenic element there. So I think comparing and contrast all these different periods is itself very productive and helpful. And my takeaway from all this is probably actually focusing on who are the ones who are producing these discourses, and in terms of the Sigma of Asia you mentioned, and I think it's a self-imposed rhetoric actually. It started with European perception of the Turkish man, but then I think Chinese elites, in order to save the country from the imperial invasion and self-strengthening oneself, they self-impose this nowadays, right, derogatory term onto Chinese society to make their agenda going forward. And also in the 80s, talking about, that's the time there's the first sense of crisis about manhood, because right after Mao died, again, intellectual elites, most of them or all of them men, were so worried that goes to Zhong Xueping's book titled Masculinity Besieged, because they felt like they're being emasculated during the Mao era when the country's rhetoric is women can hold half the sky. So again, you see elite men were the agent promoting this kind of discourses. So comparatively speaking, I think what's interesting today is you see the kind of appropriation of such discourses by the state, or a collaboration, or another way, maybe elite men's strategy to compete for attention, 揣测上意, right? Guessing what the empire thoughts play in this to see a new mode of production of such discourses. That's my takeaway by historical comparison.
And Professor Long?
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna just add on what Yige was talking about. I think it's fantastic to always go back to the history. I think it's always important to avoid ridiculing what is going on right now. So I think here, I think both Yuchen and Yige had already talked about, I think this to put it in the context, especially to think about the context of the construction of sick man. I think that's very, very important. And certainly there are a lot of the practical issues that Yuchen was talking about. There is the concern over families, the concern over reproduction. The government wanted to encourage people, to have more kids. So it's really interesting because in the past, I think the moral panics mostly focused on women. And this time, suddenly you have both men and women got involved. Okay, both sides, let's have more kids together. I think what is much more sort of, I think to go back to what Yuchen was talking about, like how to think about the kids as rational, sort of this kind of building or formation of rationality and what is considered as a legitimate idea. That also goes back to, right now there is a huge surge of this lying flat Tangping. So how to promote the productive, subjectivity, which are submissive to the state, love the nation. I think that's a very big part of it. But what I'm really worried about is that I think there is a revitalization of social Darwinism. Maybe it has never ever left us. But okay, if we go back to Liang Qichao, in the same, he talked a lot about the segment. He talked about the relations between the body, the mind, the man's power, and then the nation. And he has this paragraph, I'm gonna just read it. Along with the segment, then he has this paragraph, okay, the only thing that matters in this world is power. The strong may bully the weak, but it is a fundamental law of nature. Those who want to have freedom and assert their rights have no alternative ways of achieving those objectives other than strengthening themselves and increasing their power. For an individual who wants freedom, he must begin with strengthening his body. For a country that wants to achieve independence, it must strengthen itself, quote. So you can see this kind of rhetoric actually has, you can see a lot of sort of parallel between what was talked about back then and what is being talked about now, even though now China is in a completely different place. But this belief in social Darwinism, this belief in who has the power, who is a man, who is going to rule the world, is still fundamentally there. And I think this kind of idea of cultivating the youth to believe in this kind of self-strengthening movement that happened like more than 100 years ago, to really think about how to enrich the nation, to strengthen the military. I think back then there was a major thing to think about. Liang Qichao and his elite colleague had promoted a lot of things that are critical for nations, such as commerce, industry, military. And then now you might add the obsession with technology, okay, to the equation. But it's very, very similar in terms of think about, we are gonna be powerful, then we need to have like really strong generation of youth who can, take on the world. So I think this really, the traditional social order based on the rule of propriety had really changed, completely subverted at the time. And it was replaced by a very new order predicted on the rule of competition and power. And this development, I think it produces a very different mental outlook. If we think about the traditional Chinese philosophy, it was very different compared to this kind of, tradition. It was very westernized. So in a very ironic, but also very post-colonial way, I think China's thinking about, how to survive, I think the survival, we're still in that mode. It's really just unfortunate, like after such a long time. But I really want people to keep that in mind, is that China was conquered by so many people, occupied by so many countries for a very long time. So that history has not really left us. And I think the insecurity play a huge role in what is going on in terms of masculinity sort of crisis. And it is also very important to remember that kind of, the belief in social Darwinism actually during the May 4th intellectuals outlook, that movement had to change that. That look at, talking about, we should place more emphasis on mutual assistance, mutual understanding instead of competition. We should emphasize morality, spirituality instead of power and material wealth as the key to really to turn China into a strong nation. So in that kind of sense, I think that kind of idea of universalism, to think about, humankind as a foundation of modern world order, is also part of a Chinese tradition, which we should totally go back to. The kind of cosmopolitan idea about how to be a man, how to be a woman is really what we should, inherit and cultivate among the youth. So that's I hope that sort of makes sense. Yes.
Yeah, that's a very great point. I think we are about to open the Q&A part of the panel. And
yeah, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. We have so many questions. So I'm telling you already, people in the audience, I'm going to try. I don't think we're going to be able to address everything, and I'm going to try and combine a few things. So also, this is so good that I had planned somewhere to start, and then I'm just going to change them all together, because I think I have a question that was immersed in the chat that was also picked up in the Q&A that is kind of related to all this. And this is related to this idea of this complexity of building masculinity with this like very American Western model, while trying to contrast that and building then a completely different version of the American model, right? So trying to get that, harness that power and change the dynamics. So the question would be like, is this related then to this thing that we've seen the state do, particularly towards non-normative genders and sexualities, and that members of the LGBTQ community have know very well in China, which is the idea of trying to build these sexualities as an American import. And that way, it's a nice two birds, one stone of, look, I'm doing that. So that's a Western import, and also equating that with weakness aligns with the state project of realigning these dynamics of power. So do you see that happen? Is this what we're seeing? Any thoughts on that?
You're spot on in terms of, I'm gonna start, you can, I think you're spot on in terms of constructing how to gayness or any non-gender conformative as something from the West. I think that has always been the rhetoric in the 80s, 90s. And the state was not really dealing with it. At the time, it was really a taboo. And again, I wanted to highlight the fact that it might seem forever, but even back in the late 1990s, I mean, to have a hotline for, just gay men and lesbian was underground work because of the police harassment and so on. So really, we have made great progress. I think the society, the movement itself has made great progress, but not for a very long time. So I think in many ways, the victory, the triumph is very fragile and very young. That's one thing. And secondly, I also think in many ways, the gay community, a lot of it are also supporting the heteronormative agenda in terms of the promoting of family, the newer familiarism. It's very popular among some of the biggest LGBT organizations. So I think in that way, there is always this very complicated relationship between the supposedly mainstream, safe sort of gay identity, and then what is really going on. In that sense, I think right now, I would say if you look at the People's Daily's report, then I think that they're actually much more aware of what is going on. The problem is that when other parts of the civil society had already been demolished, or it's really difficult to say, hey, LGBTQ group will be safe. I don't think so. It's just in this kind of environment, nobody is safe. But to what extent, if we're really going to go back to 20 years ago, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think People's Daily actually is saying, oh, there are different kinds of masculinity. We should not discriminate and so on. So I think there is a sort of battle between the society, the state, as well as the market. I'm optimistic in some way, yes.
I'm afraid that shall I say more? Yan did a great job already, or shall we move on to another question to give others a chance? I don't know what's the.
Yeah, I have many, and they're all very interconnected. I have so one question that was posed early on. We kind of got there a little bit, but I'm also going to hijack it very selfishly to ask you something. And this is about the relationship between manhood and time spent online, because we've talked about this other policies that seem to be impacting the time spent online. And the way that I'm going to hijack this is this also telling us something about the state anxiety about people having a lot of influence? And I'm thinking particularly of K-pop fandoms having a lot of influence. And of course, we all know, the typical K-pop image, it speaks to that image that China is trying to erase from TV. So is that connected? The idea of having youth having a lot of power online, being able to mobilize at a click, and we've seen the political power that can be. Is there something there?
I realize I invite you to give a more difficult question. My reading of all this is in whether it's connected. From very distant viewpoint, I think the state is changing towards being more kind of pushing productive agenda in a Foucauldian sense, right? To have a more productive capitalist state. So it's very worried about all kinds of alternative subversive forms of livelihood that cannot be really captured in this heteronormative productive regime. So going back to the example of flying lying flat, right? Also the sample adaptation. So basically a street type of boys and also girls, migrant workers who refuse to go back to the factories to manufacturing for the world, who decide to work for 1 day and play for 3 days. And that number of the population is growing, which trigger a series of problems like rising cost of labor, so on, relative shortage of cheap labor, so on and so forth. So the state is trying hard to make everybody fit into the ideal model of a productive regime. Then you have those who spend too much time online playing video games, and also those who are so obsessed, quote unquote, with K-pop, right, to try to enjoy themselves instead of hammer themselves into the big machine running for economy. So in terms of macro connections, yes, but in terms of micro connection, right? Again, I think it will be a fascinating dissertation or something to study the politics of how policies are being manufactured in today's Chinese state. Which I don't have an empirical answer.
Great. I have a specific question for Professor Long, which is about what do you think? How do you think the traditional term of Renyao fit into this picture regarding both the Chinese traditional gender ideology as well as the attack on Sissy men?
Which term?
Renyao.
Renyao.
Mm-hmm.
Oh. First of all, I'm not so sure if
completely.
It's traditional. I'm not so. So first of all, okay, I would have to look into it, but my intuition is that this is not a traditional term. I think when it appeared in literature world, it meant something completely different. I do really think this is probably something else. That's my intuition, but I can't say 100%. So I'm sorry, I don't have enough knowledge about it to speak to it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I also have a question that goes back to our idea of the power dynamic with the West, but also brings in, is this connected to the perception of Japan and Korea as more of a threat? So like the idea of building a Chinese masculinity that is different from what the West has identified as like a traditional Asian masculinity or Asian femininity. Do we see that transnational dynamics in the East Asian zone, like geographic area, play a role?
I would say absolutely yes. If you look at what is happening in China, South China Sea, if you look at how Japan is sending out ships in support, all this, the controversy around submarine in France, in Australia, and Japan, yes, absolutely. There is that factor. And also, I mean, partially when you think about domestically nowadays, I mean, most people's life, most people's actually livelihood no longer depend on the state. They depend on the market. They depend on something else. So the state doesn't have as strong control over the population. So when you wanted to restore some of the previous control over your society, it's getting really difficult. So at some level, I think the state is also trying to do different things, trying different approaches. And I think always instigating anger and fear against some imagined perceived enemies is always very safe, and it has been deployed multiple times. Yeah.
Xiaogao, I saw that you had in the Q&A that you had a comment from the perspective of trans studies. Can we, if you want to voice it, I think there's a way for you to do that if you raise your hand. I might be wrong. If not, I will just read your question while we figure that out. The question is, to what extent is the effort to regulate cis men also an effort to uphold gender binarism? Or the failure to incorporate gender nonconforming into existing institutions? Oh, there you go. You can ask that yourself.
Oh yeah, I think, hey everyone, sorry. I was just thinking that because I was doing an archive study and I found that there's a, so we were studying transness representation in state discourse, and we found that there's also a lot of masculinity crisis that comes in along with it. And I think that there just seems to be a connection where the concerns for cis men is also a question about how do we deal with this kind of masculinity or gender expression, because I suppose from the point of the state that gender expression and gender identity is the same thing. and that the question is like, how do we incorporate something as masculinity or gender expression into existing institutions when, right, for trans people, we can incorporate them through medical and legal and state surveillance system, but what about the kind of more elusive way of expressing your gender out of the binary? And it doesn't seem to be having an institutional institutional approach to put them back into the, how do you regulate something that's more elusive, more expensive, that doesn't follow necessarily a medical model? So I wonder, because we talked about from the kind of point of like international relations, economy, and kind of historicizing it, but I wonder, what does it mean when we bring into the question of gender binary into the kind of conversation?
That's a very valuable question. So are you asking like what like critical scholars should advocate, or like how do we think of the contemporary practice? I'm sorry, would you mind clarifying your last part of the question?
Sorry, I wasn't clear on that. I just wondered what role does gender binarism and the continuation of wanting to keep upholding it having to do with the masculinity crisis that we were talking about?
What I can say is I think that's very important to bring up this binary and to go back to queer method as a epistemological approach to think about all this. And sometimes even researchers ourselves maybe sometimes are not aware of by talking about something, we're reifying some of the categories. So I appreciate actually Patrice Liu's work talking about queerness into China. I benefit from a lot learning from that. My observation is in practice, it's not only in the medical field, but in daily everyday life in China, it's really hard actually to challenge all the binaries in a lot of senses in your social life. But discursively speaking, you've seen in literature, in the the online fictions in the for instance, the boys love community, by the way, which is if you want to talk about, right, China's influence, actually China's writers on the online community is doing something fantastic. It has an audience globally in Japan, in Korea, based on my colleagues, what my colleagues told me. So I think in the discursive realm, there is space. In Patrice Liu's work, he talks about how Taiwanese queer literature have a big influence in help the mainland communities imagine a alternative gender realm. So there's a space definitely there that we need to better study. But in daily practice, I think it's such a essentialist logic of gender still going on. Institutionally, how to challenge it, it's very difficult. Thanks for your question.
I'll add to what Yige was talking about. I think this is a fantastic question. I would totally think, yes, this is honestly any attempt to try to police the boundary of masculinity is ultimately about upholding gender binarism. I think that's always the case. But I think there is also, we might need to be cautious about against this idea of like the Chinese state is all powerful and rational, who takes very thought out, planned out activities. I think that's one thing my work I'm trying to go in against is that not really, especially when we talk about a moral panic. It's a panic because it's not rational and there's a lot of imagination going on. And I think it's very typical, very, very typical for government around the world. They're just again and again, they would consider like gays as some foreign conspiracy against them. different governments would worry. Like both Soviet and the US government were worried about this gay penetration into their, society, government, and so on. So I think in that way, it's very similar to that. I mean, it's very hard to read too much into what Chinese government is trying to do. I think this is sort of in the larger context of definitely they want to uphold the gender binary for sure. They think that is very critical to the political, social, especially to social agenda. I think so. And I think they definitely have, I think a lot of things you were saying, I think absolutely true. They wanted to police what Yige was also talking about, the discursive space, because things are out of, at least their opinion, things are out of control. So I think there are a lot of things going on. I mean, because I was very much high on data. Without solid data, I'm hesitant to make any argument on that. Yes, but thank you very much for that question. Yes.
I actually want to make a short comment on that point, because I really appreciate the point about like kind of dissecting the black box of the state, right? Like the state, the government is just not this one thing that is very rational and has a clear vision about what it's going to do. And in fact, we have some moments where the state stance on like LGBTQ rights is more hospitable or like doesn't fit so well with the policy that we are discussing today. So like in 2018, there's this People's Daily article, fireworks of different forms can also blossom, which was kind of like a response to Weibo's censorship of homosexuality related content. And in 2019, during the Hong Kong anti-extradition bill protest, the Communist Youth League endorsed this kind of fangirl protecting brother China kind of online nationalist discourse. And this discourse actually personified China as one of the kind of effeminate idol that is now trying to gender police, right? It's in that kind of discourse, China is like a charming, vulnerable, metrosexual idol bullied by Western trolls that needs to be protected by girls. So there are these kind of fuzzy moments that are important to grapple with, and they kind of remind us to not think about the state as a unified actor in making these decisions.
I love this so much. And I want to be mindful of everyone's time because we are over. And I do feel that this is a fantastic conversation to close on because we leave you with the messiness of this, right? Like we can't really make sense of it because it just, that's what states do. They say one thing, they contradict themselves, they seem to make sense for a second and then they don't. And I love this. That's what makes like this discussions so great because you connect it to so many different dynamics and so many different things that are happening. So I just want to close thanking everyone, thanking our two panelists. This was an incredible conversation. So thank you both for your time and for your thoughts and for your comments. Yuchen, you have been the driving force behind all of this. So thank you so much. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Tate. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Gender Sexuality. Thank you to Global Studies. And thank you all in the audience. Your questions were great. I hope we have addressed enough. And I hope you're still curious after this. So on that note, have a good night, everyone, or a good day, depending on where you are. This was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.